In this lecture, I'm going to give an overview of landscape materials, and then go over the various tools available in paint mode of the landscape system. In the next lecture, I'll go into more detail about landscape materials. So to set the material for a landscape, with the landscape selected, in the Details panel, under the Landscape category, there is a landscape material property. And so, for example, I'm going to set this to the grass material from the starter content. And it will apply the material across the entire landscape. Alright, but while you can use any regular material for a landscape, there is a small group of landscape nodes available in the material editor that allow you to construct materials that are especially made for landscapes. So I'm going to show you how to construct a material from these nodes and what the advantages are. So I'm going to create a new material asset, name it My Landscape Material, and then open it in the editor. So to start out, I'm going to go back to the content browser, then go to the textures folder in the starter content, and I'm going to drag in the T ground grass D texture. And I'm going to connect this to the base color, and then save the material. And now I'm going to go back to the level editor, and I'm going to set the material for the landscape to be this My Landscape Material asset I just created. Alright, and so this will look a little different from what I just had because that was the grass material, which consists of the grass texture plus other nodes. This material so far is just the grass texture by itself. Probably the most noticeable difference is that the tiling is very obvious now. Across large distances, you can see the repeating pattern of the texture. So I'm going to go back to the material editor, and I'm going to add a landscape layer coordinates node to the graph. This is just like the texture coordinate node we saw in the materials section, except that it is especially made for landscape materials. So I'm going to connect its output to the UVs pin of the texture sample node. And now, if I select the node, I can edit its properties. This mapping scale property works just like the U tiling and V tiling properties do on the texture coordinate node. And then there's also properties to rotate or pan the texture. But right now, I'm just concerned about the tiling. So I'm going to change the value of the mapping scale property to 5 to make the texture 5 times as large. And so now I'm going to apply this and go back to the level editor, and now the tiling isn't nearly as bad. Alright, so as we saw in the landscape overview lecture, the real power of landscape materials comes from their ability to have landscape layers, not to be confused with the edit layers of the landscape itself. So now I'm going to edit this material to be just like the one I showed you in the overview lecture. So the key to creating landscape layers is to use the landscape layer blend node. So I'm going to add one of those nodes to my graph, and then make sure it's selected so I can edit its properties. Okay, so I want to create a gravel, grass, and snow layer, just like in the overview lecture. So I'm going to click on this plus sign next to the layers property 3 times to create 3 layers. For each layer created, it will add an input on the layer blend node. And now I can expand these menus to see the properties of each layer. I can do this individually, or I can right-click on the layers property and select Expand All. Okay, so for now, I'm just going to give each one of these layers a name. So I'm going to name them Gravel, Grass, and Snow. And this will update their names on the node. And now I'm going to go back to the Textures folder in the starter content, and add the T ground gravel D texture to the graph. And I'm going to connect the landscape coordinates node to its UVs pin. And now I'm going to create a vector 3 node and set each of its values to 0.81 to create a slightly off-white color I'm going to use for the snow. And now I'm going to connect the gravel texture to the gravel layer, the grass texture to the grass layer, and the snow color to the snow layer. And then I'm going to connect the output of the layer blend node to the base color. And now I'm going to save this and go back to the level editor. And now, if I go to paint mode, it will display the landscape layers I created down here under the layers property, and it will display a preview of each one. But before I can begin painting with these layers, there is one more thing I must do to prepare them. For each layer, I will need to create something called a layer info object, which is used to define a set of properties for each layer. To create a layer info object, I just need to click the plus sign for that layer, and then select between weight blended layer and non-weight blended layer. Alright, so the way landscape layer blending works is that no matter what settings you use, each layer will have a value for each vertex stored behind the scenes, referred to as that layer's painted weight. When you use the paint tool, it will increase the painted weight values of the vertices that get painted for whatever layer is currently selected. And so for each vertex of the landscape, the engine will look at the painted weight for each layer. The more weight a particular layer has for a vertex, the more of its data will be used in the blending of the layers for the pixels in that area. Okay, so again, no matter what settings you choose, this is the system that will be used. So it can be easy to get confused and think that these weight blended and non-weight blended options refer to whether or not to use this system. But what they actually refer to is whether or not painting on a layer should decrease the weights of the other layers. So when a layer is set to weight blended, painting on one layer will not only increase the weight of that layer, it will also decrease the weight of all the other layers. But when a layer is set to non-weight blended, painting a layer will only increase the weight of that layer and will not affect the other layers. Okay, so for now, I'm just going to set these all to weight blended, which is the most common setting. So after choosing the option, I just need to choose a name and location for saving the asset. And once I do that, it will automatically apply the newly created layer info object to that layer. So now I'm going to do this for the other two layers as well. Alright, so once my landscape material has layer info objects for each of its layers, it will be able to render them. Any areas without any painted weight will use the base layer, which will be the first layer on the layer blend node, and the first layer on this list. And so because I haven't painted anything on my landscape yet, it will display the gravel layer at full strength for the entire thing. Okay, but now I'm going to select my grass layer, and using the paint tool, I'm going to begin painting onto the surface of the landscape. And so by applying this tool, I am increasing the weight of the grass layer in certain areas. And because I set the grass layer to be weight blended, I am also decreasing the weight of the gravel layer. And so you can see that the areas where the grass has more weight is blending in more of the grass texture in that area, and the areas where the gravel has more weight is blending in more of the gravel texture. And then I could also select my snow layer and begin painting in snow. Alright, so in addition to the paint tool, paint mode also has versions of the smooth, flatten, and noise tools. The smooth tool is used to balance the weights of all the layers in the area that it is applied to. So to demonstrate, I'm first going to set the brush fall off to 0, and then use the paint tool to paint in an area of grass, creating a hard edge with the gravel layer. So let's say I don't like how hard this edge is here, and I want to smooth it out a bit. I can select the smooth tool, and then drag it along the edge, and it will begin to change the weights of all the layers to be more equal to each other. If I apply the tool enough, eventually the weights will become perfectly balanced, and the tool will no longer have any effect in that area. So this tool is useful when you're trying to create a smooth transition between different layers. The flatten tool can be used to apply the same weight to a layer across a large area. So if you recall, when this tool is used in sculpt mode, it will store the height of the vertex that is first clicked on, and then as the brush is dragged around, it will raise or lower the height of those vertices until they are equal to the height of the first vertex. The flatten tool's behavior in paint mode is very similar. So for example, I'm going to select my grass layer. And then I'm going to click on an area of the landscape where the grass layer's painted weight is 0. And so now, if I drag the brush across areas of the landscape that do have grass weight, that weight will be lowered to 0 and the grass will be removed. Or I could click on this area where the grass weight is high, and as I drag the brush around, the grass weight of the surrounding areas will be raised to match. Alright, and then the noise tool can be used to randomly raise or lower the painted weights of a layer. So if I select the grass layer, for example, and then drag this tool over an area, it will raise and lower the weights of the grass based on a random noise pattern. Alright, and then for all of these paint tools, there is this property, painting restrictions, which can be used to restrict the painting of layers in various ways on a per component basis. This can be useful if performance is a big issue, and you want to restrict the rendering cost of your landscape material. By default, this is set to none, meaning there will be no restrictions. With this set to limit layer count, each component will be limited to the number of layers defined by the max painted layers per component property on the landscape actor. With this set to 0, there won't be any restrictions. But if I were to set this to 2, for example, then I would only be able to paint 2 layers on any given component and no more. This will only work, however, if the number of layers painted on the component doesn't already exceed the max value. And then with painting restrictions set to existing layers only, you will only be able to paint a layer onto a component if that component already has that layer painted on it somewhere. So this can be useful if the rendering cost of your landscape material is already as high as you're willing to go, but you still want to make painting changes. This setting can ensure that you don't accidentally increase the current layer count of any particular component. And then with this set to component allow list, painting will be restricted to only layers that are defined in a certain property that exists for each component. So I'm going to switch to manage mode, and using the select tool, I'm going to select a component. So down here, there is this property layer allow list. Whatever layers are already painted onto the component will appear in this list. If I want to add an additional layer to this list, I can click on the plus sign and then set the layer info object for the layer I want to allow. Alright, and that will conclude part 1 of the landscape paint mode lecture.